Hi, my name is Keith Cooper of Northlight Images, and in this video I'm going to have a look at the Nikon 45mm PC-E tilt shift lens, or perspective control as Nikon call them sometimes. It's quite an old lens. It's been around a few years now, and it's an F-mount lens. That means I'm testing it on a Z7 here, and I'm using the FTZ adapter. Now, I'll come back to some of the areas that causes and some considerations you need when using it to allow for the fact that it's the kind of lens it is and using on a modern camera. Works perfectly well, I should say. There is no significant problem with that. Mirrorless cameras, both Canon and Nikon, I use with adapters for old lenses. It's rarely a problem. The lenses are often quite good anyway, and they can match up quite well to the performance you can get out of the new cameras. Particularly this one's got image stabilization, various other things in it that make the lens even easier to use. So you can even use shift and tilt handheld if you want. I would normally use tripod. Notice the FTZ adapter has a tripod mount on the bottom here, as well as the camera one. Which one you use depends on how you set up your tripod and things. But anyway, it's a fairly straightforward lens. 45mm focal length, f2.8. So you see the front extends with focusing, and it's quite a nice focus throw. It's not quite 180 degrees, so 160 odd degree focus throw. Now, one of the things I like about older lenses like this is that you get much more sensitivity in the focus than you tend to get with more modern lens designs. So there's actually in the settings here on the scale you can read, you can actually see differences in settings between, say, 12 feet, 5 feet mentioned on this. It's not all scrunched at the end, which I tend to find if you're using manual focus on some newer lenses, it can be an issue. The aperture is set either by the control ring here, or you can put it into an auto mode, so it's a stop-down mode. But it goes from 2.8 to 32. By the time you get to 32, it's going to be showing distinct softening, and also it will show up any dust on the sensor. If you want to see how much dust there is on your sensor, stop your lens down to f22 or more, like 32 on this one if you can get it, and you really will see the dust. It shows up a treat. But anyway, this one goes to 2.8. I'd note that during my testing with the Z7, I was able to set it so that the minimum aperture displayed turned to 3 and the numbers were a bit odd. Now, I put that down to my inexperience of using the camera, so it's not a problem with the lens. I've checked the EXIF data of the first lots of photos, and the apertures are exactly as set here. Now, I tended to use it in fully manual mode, but you can use it sort of aperture priority, so you set your aperture and either the exposure or the ISO can be changed automatically. Works perfectly well with shift as well. One of the problems with using tilt shift lenses on DSLRs was that if you shifted the lens much, and lens shift is like this, so the lens shifts up and down, or you tilt it, so there's lens tilt. If you do that, it completely messes up the metering system inside your camera. Not so for mirrorless cameras that don't seem to suffer from this in nearly the same way. So you can be a lot more confident in your metering than you could with a DSLR, where you effectively have to set your metering with no tilt and shift, set your values, then add shift, add tilt as you're required for it. Now, I've only had the lens for I should say that I use Canon lenses in my day-to-day work, just because of the ones I have and the cameras I have. I have no particular favoritism one way or the other. So some aspects, and I'll happily admit them, are to my inexperience in using the camera. I always say, if you're going to evaluate a camera, you can't do it in a week or so. In a week or so, you can get some useful impressions, but a lot of learning to use a camera and system comes over time. But anyway, let's just move here. The view This is a view I've used a lot of De Montfort University, which is fairly close to here. And it shows what you get with 45mm, which is a fairly natural looking perspective. Now 45 is just that little bit wider than the so-called standard 50 on a full frame or FX camera. And it gives a reasonable perspective. You don't get any undue compression. I would, for architectural work, which is my main work, I would generally prefer a 24 or 35mm lens with shift, and maybe even, say, for wide angle shots I'd want something like the PC-E 19 or the Canon version, the TSE-17. They give a lot more coverage. Remember too that the way shift lenses work, tilt and shift lenses work, is that the lens actually has a large image circle. Think of them as lenses for medium format cameras. In fact, you can use a lens like this on a large format camera, and the image circle, that's the image projected by the lens on the center, is big enough for a medium format system. Works perfectly well. But what that means is when I add shift, I'm looking at different parts of the image circle. Now, I've written lots of articles and done a few videos as well about using tilt, using shift, so I'm not going to go into that in any significant detail. Suffice to say that if you want to know, I've got lots of articles about it, videos, and I have written a book, Photography with Tilt and Shift Lenses, which goes into far more detail than you ever thought you really wanted to know. But that's widely available in good bookshops. Anyway, there's the view you get. It's a nice lens, it's nice and sharp. I have no real problems with it. In testing for resolution, and I noticed that it is a little soft and there's distinct vignetting at f2.8. That's without any shift. Take it to about f8 and that vignetting is almost gone, particularly with shift, which exacerbates the effects of vignetting. So I would use this lens for daily use. I would use it probably slightly higher if I was using shift, slightly higher than f8. I might use the mid-stop between 8 and 11. I might use it even at f11. I know it's a high resolution camera and some people will be worried about diffraction limiting. Yeah, get over it, it's not that significant a problem. And if you're using much shift, you're working at the edge of the image circle, and that is where image quality drops off for any lens. So you will notice it if you start working at wide apertures. Now, you might want to work at wide apertures using tilt for effects, but in that point you're not that concerned about detail. But if you're doing detail, you're going to have to stop down the lens, particularly with any amount of shift. Now that's a view across the De Montfort University. I've got lots of views of this place. It's not that far from here, so I use it a lot during my lens testing. Once again, 45mm gives a quite naturalistic perspective. There's no exaggeration. If I was to take this shot using a wider lens, standing fairly close to here, you'd tend to get a much more extreme view. Now look at some of the other reviews I've got of different lenses, different focal lengths, and you'll see how much difference it makes. 45 is not a focal length I'll use a great deal in my architectural work, but it does have a place, as do longer focal lengths as well. Now, just an ordinary shot with the camera in portrait orientation, with vertical shift to keep the vertical lines true on the picture. Invariably, the reason you use shift is because you want to keep vertical lines true. Because if you tilt the camera back, buildings have that feeling of they're falling over. This cures that. Now, you don't have to do it. You can use, it's a perfectly good 45mm lens for taking shots normally. You don't have to use the tilt and shift function. There's no real need for that. But that's a typical view as what I'd expect from using a lens like this. I've had to come step back fair way, but the building doesn't look huge. Now if I take a shot of this building closer with a wider lens, the building will have a much more extreme perspective. It'll look much more angled, the shot looks more dynamic. That can be good, it can be not good. It's up to you for your composition as to what you think works best. But there we go with the main building there, the Vijay Patel building, with a view from that. And that's with just with a camera like that, but with some vertical shift. Now, how do I get vertical shift when the lens shifts like that? Well, there's a little lever on the side that lets me rotate the lens. Now, you can freely rotate it, total 180 degrees, and now the shift is like that. So that allows you to decide your angle of shift. I move it back, there we go. There are click stops at 30-degree steps. Now, I would prefer they were at 15-degree steps, because then you get 45 degrees included as well. Now, that's a criticism I have of quite a few lenses like this, as to where the click stops are. It just depends how you use the lenses, but if you rotate the lens much, you'll find that sometimes you really do want it not at 30-degree steps. You'd prefer something a bit finer. But as I say, perspective's fairly nice. It gives the people, nobody looks out of scale here. If I'd used a wider angle lens, I could make the space look much larger. Now, one of the reasons I use wider angle lenses is to make the space look larger, but sometimes I don't want that effect, and that's where something like this or a 50mm, somewhere in that focal length, is more useful. But it purely depends on what you're looking for in your shots. This is done with some vertical shifts, so you can see all the vertical lines are still true and vertical. Now, in terms of distortions for the lens, this is just a view, sat on a tripod, pointed, and these slats on the front of the building are very good for showing any distortions. I've got vertical shift, so the centre where I'm aiming the camera at is about here, towards the bottom of the picture, and then the lens is shifted upwards. So this is showing the extremes of the lens image circle. And there is a very, very slight bowing. So you've got a bit of pincushion distortion that's visible at extremes. Now, you need something like this, an image with lots and lots of straight lines, a grid, to even show it. It's really quite low and not a significant issue. You can correct it with lens correction software if need be, but there are very few images during the ones that I took that actually show it. And in fact, the ones that show it are ones where I deliberately put straight lines close to the edge of the frame to try and show that. It's not a significant problem. Perhaps more of an issue, certainly would have been with film, is the chromatic aberration. And this is a several 100% zoom of the top right hand corner of that previous image I just showed you there. So that's up here. And with this one, it's showing a chromatic aberration. Now, I'm not even using the Nikon software here to process the raw files, so this is just camera raw, and an old version at that. And I'm just using the automatic chromatic aberration removal. And if I apply that, it gets rid of it. Now, that's pretty much fixed. There are a few little effects on it, but effectively, chromatic aberration, yes, you get it with the lens, but it's eminently fixable. I've got no problems with it whatsoever. It certainly doesn't hinder my use of it. Similarly with flare, this lens is really nice for resistant to lens flare. Now, it comes with a hood, and I would say if you're using full shift, take the hood off, because at full shift, you just get a tiny bit of corner vignetting because of the shift. But that's only really then to take care of. You don't normally need that. I say that comes off easily enough like that. It's a 9-blade aperture, which gives if I count them up, there are probably 18 sun stars there. That's a look towards the sun, underexposed. We can see a tiny little patch of light here, a bit of flare, but the lens is remarkably resistant to flare. This picture here, a corner of a building, I've got the sun just coming over the edge of the building to try and show it, and there are no lines, there are no streaks. I haven't found any significant problems anywhere in the image for that. It really is quite good. But obviously, if you're shooting towards the sun, do keep the sun off the front element. It's somewhat recessed, so that does help give a bit of shape for that, but if need be I just use my hand or something like that just to make sure the sun doesn't shine directly on the lens, because it just reduces contrast. That even if you don't get much flare, you still will get a reduction in contrast very slightly. Now, tilt. You notice I've started off with shift. The reason I start off with shift is because it's the easiest to explain. Shift people get quite quickly. Tilt, I know a lot of people have difficulty, and they end up just sort of setting the tilt on the lens because it just bends the lens one way or the other. You know, people do it with that and then they just think, well, what does it look like? Oh, I'll change it a bit. They've got no method behind it. It was writing articles about explaining how to use tilt that led me to all the stuff that I did that's in the book. So if you really want to know how to use tilt, and then have a look in the book, all the articles on the website, and I have done a few videos as well. But with tilt like that, and you can use it with shift as well. You don't have to use tilt and shift together. You can use them as appropriate. With tilt, the plane of focus, rather than just being flat in front of you, think of focusing on a wall, as you tilt the lens, that plane of focus tilts round. And in this example here, I'm looking along a wall. Now I've shot this at f2.8, and shooting at f2.8 means the depth of field is quite small. However, it's sharp right from this wall here, this image here, from the brickwork is sharp right the way through to the distance here. So the plane of focus is effectively running along that wall. Now, I've shot this at f2.8, and I wouldn't normally, unless I'm trying to emphasize the use of tilt. If you want to show you're using tilt, then a small aperture really helps. So for things like the miniature world effect and things like that, the f2.8 on this is really quite good. It looks, you know, I find the miniature world effect something that I can try and think, yeah, done that, now what? It doesn't hold any interest to me. It's a bit of a one-trick pony. A lot of people call it the tilt shift effect. That, you know, I would say it almost annoys me, because these lenses are capable of so much more than just the miniature world tilt shift effect. That is just one tiny bit of what you can do. And if I'm honest, an awful lot of examples I've seen of it look pretty naff. But that's just a personal opinion. Yeah, mileage may vary. But anyway, looking along this wall here, so this is distinctly out of focus on the side here, and it's sharp all the way. Now, if I stop this down to, say, f8, we would get absolute pin sharpness right the way through here, and even over here would be still fairly sharp. Take it to f11 and much of the image will be sharp. You don't have to show that you've used tilt when you're using it. I mean, a more obvious example would be this line of bikes. So these are e-bikes here in Leicester, and I've run the plane of focus along so that the emphasis is on this one wheel here with its motor in it, and the logo at the top here, that is sharp. The plane of focus runs through, and if you look at the houses in the background, you'll see that there is one bit of house is sharp. The plane runs through, and the rest is out of focus. Now, this is one of the uses for strong tilt, is emphasizing content and de-emphasizing other areas of the picture. The thing I would say is that be careful of overusing it. It's a neat effect. When it works well. When it doesn't work well, it just looks like you've got some settings on the camera wrong. Now, I'm using tilt here, and you'll notice that the tilt allows the lens to go tilt that way, and in this instance, shift goes up and down that way. The two controls for this are at 90 degrees to each other. Now, in some modern lenses, you can actually change this. You can actually rotate the two axes with respect to each other and have an arbitrary connection between the tilt and shift axes. You can't do that with this lens. It is possible to modify the lens and rotate the top half of the lens by 90 degrees. Now, I've heard some people say do it yourself. Nikon seriously advised not doing it because there are parts that could be damaged. Now with the old Canon lenses, you could do it quite easily. You just needed a good quality screwdriver. Now the screws are in the same place on here that you would take these screws off, you would just rotate it and away you go. However, I'm told it causes damage. So this is one that you have to send off to Nikon to be done. Or have the parts yourself and know exactly what you're doing. It's something that you just need to be a bit careful of tinkering with. There we go. Now, how to handle the perspective of this. The quality of the lens is great, low flare, low distortion, chromatic aberration is fixable. It's the sense of scale that the lens gives you. Now, it gives you more than the standard 50mm lens, all right, it's 45, or a 45mm prime lens. You're fairly fixed. It's giving you some of the view, some of the extent that you would get with a wide-angle lens. Now, to keep this level, I would need, say, a 24mm lens. If I put 24mm lens on this without shift, kept the camera level, I could then crop out this bit. That's quite a lot of wasted pixels. I'm shifting up here and I'm just getting this view. Now it gives a much more close view than you get with the wide angle lenses. Now the ultra wide lenses such as the PC-E 19mm, which I tested a while ago, really does give you the effect of being in huge spaces. That may not be what you want, as I mentioned earlier. There's a shot of the same building but taken just round down the side of it, and I'm not sure how much use I'd get from a 45 if I was photographing big buildings. I would want, say, the 45, but have the wide angle with me as well to get that level of coverage. It just depends on what it is you want out of it. Now, a few little just tricks you can do with this, just to round this off, is that I mentioned that you can rotate the whole lens, and so you can change it from shift up that way to shift across that way. That's fair enough. You don't have to do it at 90 degrees. You can actually rotate it, and there's a little, the little tab on the side that you press in and rotate. And now we've got what I call diagonal shift. So the lens is shifting that. What does that do? Well, I've got a video that explains in more detail. But the camera is pointed here, down this path. I have shifted the lens diagonally across so that I've missed off this bit of the building I don't want. I've kept this tree in, and I've moved the viewpoint down to here from where it would have been in the middle of the frame. Now, have a look at diagonal shift if you're interested in that, if you've got one of these lenses. It's a technique I found that a lot of people don't realise you can do. They tend to think of either just up down shift, left right shift, like that. So that's with diagonal shift. Another important feature you can do with this is stitching. Now this is a simple up down stitch, so I have taken one picture with the lens shifted upwards, shift the lens down, take a second picture, and a simple flat stitch in Photoshop. The images match. Now, there is potentially a parallax issue because you're moving the lens here and keeping the camera stationary. What you should be doing is keeping the lens stationary and moving the camera up and down. Now, I've discussed that in some of the articles and things. It's not as big a problem as people make it out to be, certainly in situations like this where the up-down shift, any parallax problems are not caused by this against the background. There are ways around it. What I would say is, if you want to explore it, I've got an article about it, or a couple of articles, and a video looking at it. But it's a very important way. I've stitched two images here together, and they've given me a total of probably about 80 odd megapixels from this camera in an image. Very high resolution image. Works a treat. I do stitching all the time. Stitching allows you to make different format images. You can do left-right stitching, so that you could use for landscape, so that you can put if I put this back to left right, I could take one picture with the lens shifted that way, one picture with the lens shifted that way, stitch them together, and I've got a wider panoramic style image. Useful thing for doing with these, and the lens quality is there. Fix that chromatic aberration, easily done, and you have a lovely sharp lens. I will just finish off with just a shot. I was just walking back home, a picture inside underneath a bridge on a canal. As much as anything, this shows the quality of the camera, and I do like the Z7. Yeah, it's a very nice camera to use. The quality of the images from it is excellent. And what I look forward to is seeing when Nikon get round to making some shift lenses, tilt shift lenses, PC-E lenses for native mirrorless bodies, so you don't need the adapter. Because one slight issue with this particular lens, and I'll just take the lens off there, is that the F-mount is quite narrow, quite small. Now that means that if you do left-right, if you do a stitch of two images and you do it at a wider aperture, you get some vignetting from the inside of the mount. Now, the Z mount itself is absolutely huge in comparison to this one, so there'll be no such problems. So I'm looking forward to seeing when Nikon bring out updated versions of these lenses. This is good. Not saying it needs to be replaced, but just curious to see what comes. Anyway, I hope that's of some interest. Please do, I'll have a written article as well to cover a few more of the technical specs and more example photos that are not always that easy to show in a video. The lens is still available, works very well. As I said, you need the adapter with it. And I hope that's of interest. Lots more stuff like this. Oh, and the book. So thank you very much for looking, and please do subscribe if you find the channel interesting. Much appreciated if you do. Thank you.